Hi everyone, this is Michèle from Mammy's Country Quilts. Welcome to our how-to videos. Today's how-to video is about binding. So I'm going to show you how to calculate your binding and how to put your binding on. This is our favorite way of doing binding. It's one where your binding ends up exactly the size that it needs to be. We don't use any special rulers. All you need is a little square ruler, something like this, a 6x6 or a 4x4, just something small on the smaller size. And yeah, so we'll start with that. So the first thing we need to know is how many inches there are all the way around your project. So whether it's a quilt or a placemat or a table runner, you need to know what the length and the width of your project is. So in this case, our runner is 48 inches in length, and it's 10 inches in width. So I'm going to take my calculator and I'm going to take 48 for the first side. I'm going to add my width, which is going to be 10 inches. That gives me 58 inches. I'm going to add another 48 for the other side, and then another 10 for the last little side. So that's going to give me 116 inches in total all the way around my runner. So next step is to divide this number by 40, which is the width of your fabric that you're using for your binding. So typically cotton fabrics, width of fabrics usually range between 40 and 44. We use the smaller because we're joining our strips on a 45, so it just compensates for that variable. And also you have the odd bolts that are shorter in width of fabric, so we just go with the lesser numbers so that you know for sure that you're going to have enough fabric for your binding. So we're going to divide our 116 by 40, and that's 2.9. So I need 2.9 strips. So that means that I need 3 strips for sure, and I will probably cut 4 just to make sure, because I don't want to get to the end where I'm joining and figure out that I'm like 3 inches short. So I always make sure that I have a little bit more. So if you're at the top end, like a 2.9, I would add, you round up for sure to 3, and then you might want to add a half strip or something extra on the end of that. So once we have that figured out, you need to know how much yardage you need. So if you know you need, I'm going to say 4 strips in this case, I'm going to take 4 times the width of my binding. So typically we use 2.5 for binding, or 2.25. So I'm just going to use 2.5 for this project. So I'm going to take 4 strips times 2.5 inches, and that's going to give me 10 inches. So I need a 1/4 meter of fabric to bind my table runner. So that's the big secret for figuring out binding. So with that, I'm going to cut my strips. Okay, so I'm just going to move this out of the way. So now we're just going to cut our binding. So I'm going to use, I need 4 strips. So I'm going to cut 3 strips out of this blue. Typically I would be cutting 4, but because I want to show you how to connect the binding, it's going to be easier for me to show you if I use 2 contrasting pieces at the join. So typically this piece would be the same color as this, but I'm just going to put this on the one end of my binding just to show you what I'm doing. It'll just be easier for you to see what I'm doing. So I am just going to cut 2.5 inch strips. So I'm just going to open up my fabric here. So again, you want your fold at the bottom towards you, closest to you. And my fabric is already squared, so I'm just going to cut 2.5 inches. So again, when you're cutting, you start below your fold, you cut up to the top of your fingers and inch up, and inch up. So that's 1. So I'm just putting my 2.5 inch line on the edge of my fabric here. So once we have our strips cut, we're going to join them. Okay, so I've got my 3 strips. And again, the batiks you can't see the selvage edge on the batik, but I still cut some out because that edge is a little denser than the rest of the fabric. So I'm just going to stack these up, and I'm just going to cut about between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. Depends on the selvages. Some selvages are wider than others. So we'll take those off. And now we're going to join. So to join them, you have your strips folded in half. So that means that the wrong sides are folded together right now. So the top is going to be your right side. So I'm going to take this strip and take my second strip and put the right sides together. So I'm going to go like that. So technically you just have to put one on top of the other like this, and you're going to sew from the top left to the bottom right. The problem with this, you can see this corner, but you can't see the corner down here. So what I do is I cheat a little bit, and I just put this strip a little higher and this one a little bit past my top strip. So now I can actually see the intersection at the top left and the intersection at the bottom right, which makes it easier to sew that diagonal. So at this point, you're just going to take your ruler and you're just going to make a line with your chalk or marking pen, whatever you're using, depending on the darkness of your fabric. So I'm just going to draw a diagonal line like that. Then I will grab a couple pins, and I'm just going to pin these away from my sew line here. But I don't want it to move, so I'm just going to pin them down here. So once I have that done, I'm just going to go to my machine and I'm going to sew on that diagonal. So take those pins out. So now when you open your binding, it should be making a straight line like that. If you've sewn it this diagonal, you're going to have an L. So you'll have to take it apart and redo that. And I sewed mine just off the intersection here, just to show you what happens when you do that. So if you're not right in that intersection, you're going to create a jog like this. So you want to make sure when you're sewing, you're right in the intersection of your fabric. And once you're done doing that, you're going to trim away 1/4 inch past your sew line, and then you're going to add your next strip. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to fix that one, but you're going to just sew this next one on. So again, right sides together. You're going to sew. You're going to draw your line. Like that. And then I'm just going to pin this. So I still need to add my lighter strip to the end here. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my binding, and then I'll be right back. So I've got my bindings sewn together. So if you're happy with how that's looking, so you've got a nice straight line on both sides, you're just going to go ahead and trim those 1/4 of an inch away from the chalk line that you made, which is now your seam. So I'm just going to put my 1/4 inch line on my seam, and I'm just going to trim that. So I'll do that on all of mine. And then we're going to go and press those seams. And when we press for the binding, we press our seams open, just to reduce the bulk again. It's just the same reason that we actually sew our binding on a diagonal, so that when you're folding this over and pressing it, you can see how your seam is going from here all the way to here, instead of going up and down like this if you would be sewing it end to end, which makes it bulky. So the diagonal seam just reduces the bulk in your binding, and so will pressing your seam open. So we're just going to press those 3 seams open. Okay, so now we're going to, I'm just going to move this over here so you can see me a little bit better. Okay, so now that we have our seams pressed open, so it should look like that. You can see this one better. We're just going to take our binding now and fold it in half lengthwise. So make sure you're folding your wrong sides together. So you're just going to line up your edges, and you're just going to press your binding in half like that. Okay, so now that we've pressed our binding, we're ready to put it onto our project. So I'm just going to take my runner and I'm going to start with this slider binding here because I want that for sure at the end. So you have, if you want to make sure that this one, the first end of your binding is past the center of your project, because we're going to have to trim this when we get to that to the end. So you want to make sure that you have enough here to do that, and you're just going to line up the part of your binding that has the two edges like this. So the fold is on the left hand side, and the two loose edges are raw edges are against the edge of your runner. And I'm going to start sewing this about right here because I want some room to work here at the end. So you want to leave a tail that's past the center of your project, and you don't want to start sewing right at the end, at the beginning of your binding, but a ways down. So I'm going to start doing that. So I'm going to sew to the end of my runner, and I'm just going to grab my foot here to show you what I mean. So I'm going to have my 1/4 inch foot running along the edge of my runner and my binding like that, and I want to stop with my needle a quarter of an inch above the edge of my project. So I don't know if you can see on my foot here, there are markings. So there's a mark here and a mark here, which is in line with your needle. The space between that line right there and the one below your needle is a 1/4 of an inch. And most 1/4 inch feet have those markings, but people don't know that they're there. So what we do when we're doing our binding is we're going to sew, and we're going to line up that bottom mark with the edge of the bottom of our runner, which means that my needle is now a 1/4 of an inch above the edge of my needle. So once I get to that point, you want to make sure that your needle is down in your work, and you're just going to pivot your work so that you're going to sew at about a 45-degree angle into the corner of your runner. So you're just going to sew right off the project, so right into the corner of your project. So I'm going to do that, and I'll come back and show you here what I mean. So I'm just going to slow down here at the end. And my bottom mark on my foot is in line with the bottom of my runner. So I'm just going to pivot so that my needle is in line with the corner of my runner, and I'm just going to sew right off and cut my thread. So if you look at this, and I know you can't see because I've matched my thread to my binding, which is what you want to do, but I have stitched right here, and I stopped right there, and the edge of my project is right there. So I've got a 1/4 of an inch between where I stopped stitching my straight line to the bottom of my runner. I've pivoted and sewn off my project into the corner of my runner. So now we need to turn that corner. So you're going to take your binding, and you're just going to bring it straight up. So you're creating a 45-degree angle here. and this is just straight up. So you've got a straight line here, and you've got a 45-degree angle here. You're just going to put your finger here and fold this down on top of itself. So you want to make sure that this top fold is in line with your runner. And now we're just going to start sewing again. We're just going to start sewing above the project here and come in straight line all the way down to the bottom edge, and you're going to do the same thing. You're going to stop 1/4 of an inch above the edge of your runner. You're going to pivot and sew off into the corner. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So again, I'm stopping with that bottom line in line with the corner of my project. I'm pivoting and I'm sewing off. So again, I'm just going to turn that corner. So again, you're just going to flip this up, all the way up. So you've got a straight line on the left-hand side and a 45-degree here. Put your finger at the top of your runner and just fold your binding down in a straight line. So the top should be in line with your runner, and you're just going to start sewing again, right down to the next corner. So again, I'm going to stop at the bottom with my 1/4 of an inch above the edge of my runner, with needle down. I'm going to pivot and sew off the corner of my runner. And again, I'm going to come and bring my binding up. So you have a 45 down here, straight line on the left, put your finger here and fold over, straight down. So you want to have that fold at the top even with the edge of your project and in line with the edge on the right hand side, and we're going to sew that again to the bottom. Last corner. So again, you're going to go up. You're going to have a 45-degree angle here, straight line on the left, fold over, making sure that fold is in line with the top of your runner, and you're going to line up the edge of your binding with the edge of your runner. So now, like we did here, we only started here, we're only going to sew to about here. You want to give yourself some room to work here, so you want a nice space to work with. So I'm just going to sew about halfway into my first cloud here, and I'm going to stop there. Alright, so I'm just going to stop there. At this, when you stop and start your binding like that, you can either back stitch a little bit or do a locking stitch and then cut your thread. And now we're ready to join our binding. Okay, so just pick up my ruler here. Okay, so we're going to have, so you want to go at the center of your project. So this is an easy one. You can just fold this over to find your center. So I'm about right here. So you want to make sure that at the center of your project, the binding on your right hand side is going to overlap that center point by the width of your binding. So we cut our binding 2.5 inches. So you want to make sure you have at least 2.5 inches past this bottom binding. So we're going to, and we have lots here. So we're just going to start by cutting the bottom one. So you just want to make a nice straight cut here. So we're going to cut that like that. So now we're just going to measure over, so you want to make sure this is laying flat. And you're not pulling, you just want to make sure it's laying just nice and easy. So you can see my binding on the bottom, this light binding. I'm going to measure over 2.5 inches. So I'm going to put my 2.5 inch line on the edge of my light binding, and I'm going to mark a line on my dark binding, so like that. So I've got 2.5 inches from this line to the bottom edge of my binding. So if you're doing, for example, a 3-inch binding, you'll be measuring over 3 inches. If you're doing a 2.25 inch binding, then you're going to measure over 2.25. So you're measuring over whatever the width of your binding strips that you cut. So we cut 2.5, we're measuring over 2.5 inches. So now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to cut on that line like that. So now I'm going to take this binding, I'm just going to open it up. So you're going to open it up like this, just flip that out like that, just put it on top of your project. And this is where you have, it's nice to have a little bit of room here, because if you have too small of an opening, you're going to have all this right on top of where you're working. So the more room you leave yourself here, the easier it is. The bottom binding, you're going to rotate down towards you, and then just continue opening it up like that. And you're going to, which gives you the right side of your fabric is here, and you're going to put that right sides together with your other binding piece. And this one you have to line up right edge to edge. You can't overlap like I did for hooking up my binding together. So this has to be an exact match. So I'm just going to pin this like that, and I'm just going to mark where my corner is here with my chalk right there, and then I'm just going to pin this side like that, and then I'll take my ruler and I'm just going to make that same diagonal mark that I did when I was binding or hooking up my binding strips. So I'm just going to make that diagonal line. Then I'm just going to go and sew that. So again, you want to make sure you're corner to corner here, so you don't have a jog in your binding. Okay, and I'm going to take my pins out. And your binding, before you cut it, you can just double check. So you can see here that my binding is exactly the size that I need it. It's just going to lay right like that. It's not bubbling anywhere. It's just sitting nice and at ease on my project. So if you're happy with that, you're going to take your binding and you're going to trim 1/4 inch past the seam that you just cut. So like that. And you're just going to cut that off. And we're just going to go and press that open real quick. open. And then if you want, you can just kind of repress that in half. So now I'm just going to go and sew from where I stopped up here to where I started down here, and we'll be done. Biggest thing when you're doing this last part is you don't want to be pulling on your bindings. If you do, you're going to end up with a bubble at the end here. You just want to leave it sit as it wants to here. So now we're done. So you can see it's just sitting nice and flat. And if I bring over my binding, it doesn't matter where you look. On my binding, you will have no clue where I joined my binding because it all looks the same all the way around. So at this point, you can either finish by hand binding or by machine binding. So the way that I did this one here, my binding has, I sewed on the top first, which means that I would hand bind this piece. I would flip it over and I would hand stitch all the way down. If you wanted to machine bind the second edge, you would have put your binding on the back side and then flipped it to the front, and that I will show you on another video. So for today, that's how to figure out your binding and how to join it at the end and get it on your project. See you next time.